Hello, I'm Donal Macaulay from medicsvoices.com. Welcome to this interview where we talk to the key opinion leaders around the world. Today we're talking to Richard Smith, best known to a whole generation as the editor of the BMJ, but he's had lots of jobs as businessman, writer, and he describes himself now as a professional reader. Richard, I suppose I could say you're a restless soul.
But I like doing different things. I mean, to me, the idea that you would start a job at 18 and carry on till you're 65 doing essentially the same thing, that doesn't appeal to me at all. And I look around and I see people who, it seems to me, just go on too long. I think it's classically politicians, lots of people. You think it would have been smarter to get out sooner. I mean, my brother is a stand-up comedian, says, you want to get off the stage before people are beginning to look at their watches. And I am frivolous. I mean, ultimately, I'm not a serious person, I don't think, although I seem like that to lots of people.
What about all those serious things you addressed through the BMJ and through your career? They're not all useless?
Well, it depends what perspective you take, doesn't it? I mean, if you think we're a rock at the edge of the universe, then they are useless. But if you think, well, I've got to do something while I'm here, there are lots of things that are in a bad way. Maybe by doing something, I could improve them a bit. But I remember for some meeting of GPs, I sort of totted up a list of successes and a list of failures. And the failures far outnumbered the successes. Lots of things I launched into that just fizzled out, never really went anywhere, never made a difference.
So do you think medicine is a bit of a waste of space?
Well, there's a big question. I'm always struck by, when doctors are interviewed, those things they have in the BMJ, the sort of questionnaires, people always say, well, this is, it's been the most enormous privilege. It's been the most wonderful thing I've ever done. I never would have wanted to do anything else. It's almost as if you're obliged to say that. I mean, I'm pretty, I got off to a shaky start, really, in medicine. I mean, I've written quite a lot, and I'm always talking about Ivan Illich, who still has a huge influence on me. And I felt a lot of what was going on in the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh was more for the benefit of the doctors and the patients in a way that quite disturbed me. And then when I heard Ivan Illich say, I mean, I'm paraphrasing slightly, the major threat to health in the world today is modern medicine, seemed like an outrageous idea. But the more I've reflected on it, the more I think it's true, because I think doctors are not the least bit interested in health. I mean, if you look at the average medical textbook, it's 1,000 pages long. There's 995 pages on diseases. And then there's 5 pages at the front on health, usually written by a philosopher and not read by anybody who reads the textbook, because you never get examined on that. So we've developed a sickness system, not a health system, which I think is a big mistake. And I recently, it sort of struck me that these sickness systems are inevitably doomed because of 2 simple human things. So the first human thing is that if you're confronted by somebody who's sick, say a child with meningitis, and then beside him or her an obese child, of course you're going to concentrate on the sick child. So just as we would do as individuals, so our sickness system concentrates everything on the sick and sucks resources away from things that are actually far more important for health. I mean, you'll be familiar with the idea that probably only 10% of health is attributable to health systems. I mean, most of it is down to, socio-economic factors, the social determinants. So you suck money away from benefits, from education, from housing, from the environment, all those things that have far more influence on health. And then the second simple human urge is to do better. We'll try and invent something more. So we invent endless new drugs, new this, new that. And that's what drives up the cost of health systems. I mean, although politicians always say it's the aging population. It is to some extent, but it's much more driven by the fact that there are simply many more things that can be done. We call it health, but it's sickness, really. It's not spent on health. And as you know, I'm fascinated by death, and I think how we relate to death is one of the most crucial things about being a human being. I mean, death is fundamental, death is valuable. I did that Lancet Commission on the value of death, and the title was very much intended. Death is valuable. It's valuable because to be around people at the end of life and caring for them is one of the most interesting and rewarding things you can do, as Gandhi describes very vividly in his biography. And then I think to be constantly aware of your mortality, your death, is actually very life enhancing. It means let's just make the most of what we've got here and not keep putting things off.
So let me bring it back to this message from Illich and Skrabanek and James McCormack about the sort of the therapeutic nihilism of medicine. But the people at the center of that are the doctors. Now, you've met some pretty important and self-important doctors. So looking back, what do you think of doctors?
I think they're just like everybody else. They're not different. Some of them get tempted to behave as mini gods, but they suffer from all the same human weaknesses as everybody else. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some are greedy, some are prone to anger, some are corrupt, some are saintly. You get every kind of doctor, just as you get every kind of human being. They are human beings, and I suppose the worst thing that can happen to a doctor is to forget that, and then you're really on the road to ruin.
Now, here's another question for you, because listening to your opinion of medicine and health, and I mean, you've kind of pulled back a little bit on the doctors there, but you were giving them a hard time earlier on. If I were to grow up in that household, I would have a pretty cynical approach to medicine and doctors. So has the fact that your daughter has done medicine changed that at all?
I mean, I suppose, one of the reasons I think I might be cynical about medicine is I don't think I ever could have been a good doctor. I was too doubtful about the whole endeavor. I think she's a much better doctor than ever I would have been. She's very kind of practical, very empathetic, very good at communication, but at the same time, very, she doesn't suffer fools gladly, I suppose, is the cliche we used to have in BMJ editorials. I think she's exactly the sort of person you'd want to have look after you. And I didn't share my cynicism with her, although she wouldn't have had to go far to find it, written down in various places. And it's the sort of tale you hear all the time of people who set off into medicine with great enthusiasm, all sorts of wonderful incentives and aspirations, and then slowly but surely get ground down by the system. I mean, I spend quite a lot of time with younger doctors, and I certainly come across a lot who feel very bruised by the system.
It used to be that the concept was that you mortgaged your life away for a reward at the end in terms of seniority.
Oh, I thought you meant heaven.
No, I guess, no, in terms, I'm with it in terms of worldly goods, Richard.
All right. Oh, I see. So a pretty cynical materialist bargain.
Yeah,
I'll look after all these poor people and get up at night, but in the end, I'll live in a big house and have a yacht. I mean, of course, some doctors are going to be motivated by that, but I think a lot are not motivated by wealth. I mean, I think if you want to get really wealthy, medicine's not the best way to do it, which is why I think you see a lot of younger people thinking, I'll go into business, I'll run a company, I'll be an entrepreneur.
To a sense that even behind that cynicism, there's a bit of optimism for young people in medicine?
Yes. I mean, that question, am I an optimist or a cynic? I always quote Gramsci, I'm an optimist of the heart and a pessimist of the brain or the mind, which I think is probably the best way to be. So actually, I might sound rather dismal here, but I'm not at all. In that sense, I'm optimistic. I'm pretty pessimistic about the state of the planet. I mean, the thing that takes up most of my time these days is being chair of the UK Health Alliance on climate change. And I think, unfortunately, the more you know about the science of what's happening to our planet, the bleaker you are. And we just seem incapable of doing the things we need to do, even though those things would improve our health. And then, of course, health systems themselves are major emitters of greenhouse gases and produce a massive amount of waste, which is ending up in our rivers and seas and soil.
So let's wind back and again a little bit because you're I was going to say you're very interested. You're almost preoccupied by death. And you've written a lot about it. Now, I don't want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about something related. And that is, you used to say that doctors should write their own obituaries. Have you written yours?
It's funny you should say that. I did write one. I wrote a spoof one. And I've just been working with a friend. I mean, I have a little sort of sideline of writing obituaries or editing obituaries of people obviously before they die. I mean, I had a particular experience with Sir Anthony Grabham, who was chair of the publications committee or the journal committee of the BMA. So he was my boss in a sense. And he'd also been the chairman of council, and he was a very sort of aristocratic looking surgeon. And we were very, very different people, but actually we got on remarkably well. Anyway, 8 years after I'd left the BMJ, and I hadn't really had any contact with him, he contacted me and said he wanted to talk to me. And I thought he was going to sort of tell me off because I'd just written that notorious piece about the best way to die being cancer, which caused a lot of fuss. And I thought perhaps he was going to tell me off. But no, he wanted me to write his obituary. Because he knew he was near his end with a cancer. So I travelled up to see him, and we sat and drank and talked for 3 hours and had a wonderful time. And then I went back and I wrote his obituary. And I knew, this is a man who wants to control his legacy and his story. But I thought the great thing is because his wife and family would know that he'd written it with me, it gave more opportunity to get in light and dark, and so I did, and I enjoyed that. And at the moment, I've been editing the obituary of Joanne Roberts, whom you might remember as John Roberts. He was at the BMJ, and subsequently, back long ago, he made a transition to become Joanne. And that's been very interesting for me because it's absolutely clearly the right thing has happened, that John was a pretty disturbed individual, whereas Joanne is a wonderful, calm person who is very close to death, but actually really rather healthy at the moment. But she said to me, well, you better write your obituary because, actually you'll find it's not so easy.
Well, I'm glad you came back to that because I thought you had dodged the question and moved side
Well, I have.
beautifully. Because the thing about you working with Tony Grabham was there was a certain objectivity in it. But a self-written obituary is how you would like to be remembered. So the question is, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, I should be forgotten. That's what I was saying earlier. I don't expect to be remembered. I mean, I think it's a kind of arrogance to expect to be remembered. I mean, I suppose I will be remembered by my children and even my grandchildren, but then I'll be completely forgotten. I mean, I think it's who's going to be remembered? It seems to me it's arrogance to expect to be remembered. I mean, the vast majority of people have forgotten. It's a handful of people who aren't forgotten. And even people who were remembered for quite a while are then forgotten. I mean, unless you're Plato or Shakespeare. And then actually, even those people that are remembered, you know, they turn from what they were into some kind of myth. They're not remembered as they actually were. They turn into something different. So I don't expect to be remembered.
Rationalizing it, what I think is the way you're remembered is not what you've done, but what you've done to inspire others. And if there was something that you have done that's been, in my opinion, the greatest thing you've done, it's the inspiration you've been to so many other people. And that's influenced a lot of what's happened, particularly in medical publishing. So when you look at medical publishing and the things that you think you could possibly have had some influence in, what are the bits that stand out that you think will stand the test of time, even for a short period of time?
So I think, I mean, one of the thoughts that comes into my mind is research misconduct. You know, Stephen Locke, who was my predecessor as editor, and by the way, is still going strong at 94. I speak to him every few weeks. He got me to write about, this was in the 80s, when we didn't sign things even, about various sort of egregious examples of medical scientists sort of misbehaving and doing all sorts of things, inventing data, distorting data. And I wrote about that. And Stephen became more and more obsessed with this. But then when I became the editor, I sort of slowly but surely came across more and more examples. And one of the things we did together with Richard Horton from The Lancet and Mike Farthing, the editor of Gut, was create something called the Committee on Publication Ethics, which has now taken on quite a big life. But if you think, and also I'm involved these days with Retraction Watch, which is a sort of, they put out it's run by journalists, and I mean, they really demonstrated the extent of misconduct in medicine. So that's something I've been very interested in, but things are no better and things may well be worse. And, you know, just like I've become very skeptical of medicine, I've become very skeptical of journals. I mean, I think particularly the whole business of producing a lot of original research and sending it off to practicing clinicians on a weekly basis makes no sense whatsoever, because they don't read it. I mean, even if they did, I mean, the idea that they would change their practice in the light of, you know, one trial in a particular journal, and when you think that there are hundreds of thousands of research studies being done every year, if not millions, and you send people a sort of small, pretty well random selection of some of them, makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, what I think journals can do is really just what the mass media do, you know, raise issues, dig into issues, speak truth to power, expose corruption. But the publishing of science, I think, should be another thing altogether, and there are much better ways to distribute science. So I mean, I like the idea that I might have inspired somebody, and I always think actually of being once I was in Kumasi in Ghana, running a course, and not many people turned up. And then we had rather a lovely dinner, and I sat next to the dean, and I was expressing, you know, I'm not sure this was a big success. And he said, well, you know, you never know. You may have planted something in somebody's mind that is, you know, is like an acorn that will grow up into an oak tree. I mean, you would never even know that you'd planted that thought. I mean, I don't suppose Ivan Illich had any idea that, you know, some young, long-haired, tearaway medical student would be hugely influenced by the things he said, and that his whole life, in a way, would be affected by it. So in that way, I mean, perhaps I've said something somewhere that's motivated somebody to go on and do something more and have an interesting time doing it.
I love that image of planting the acorn.
Yeah.
Because I have to be frank with you, I think you did an immense amount of inspiration for a whole generation in medicine, and you've led to a whole range of different things that have happened. And although you may be a bit bleak and cynical, and it's a little bit depressing,
Yes.
I have to thank
Yes,
you for your inspiration to me and for the whole generations. Richard, it's just been a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you very much indeed.